Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into a wildly dark, almost graphic novel-style philosophical journey. We are going to map out the shattered mind of a knight as he goes through a total, agonizing psychological collapse. So this isn't just some grim fable or a story of madness. It's actually a really profound exploration of identity, meaning, and what literally happens when the absolute structures we rely on completely disintegrate.
Do you hear that, you piteous, bleached heavens? The rhythmic clanking of a cracked vessel dragging itself through the dust of its own delusions? Wow, just listen to that. That chilling opening from the Crimson Jester perfectly captures a mind teetering on the absolute brink of collapse. It really forces us to ask, what does it actually sound like when the lies we've been telling ourselves finally break?
Okay, let's dive into this. The knight's journey isn't just a dark fantasy. It's structured as a literal Fichtean dialectic. Now, if you're familiar with philosophy, you know this is the progression from a thesis to an antithesis and finally to a synthesis. But here's the thing. To kickstart that entire process, you need a catalyst. You need what's called the Anstoß, an initial, jarring collision or check. And for our knight, that Anstoß isn't a physical blow. No, it's the active, jagged laughter of the Crimson Jester that just completely shatters his worldview.
Section 1. The Stalking Shadow.
Section 2, Thesis, the Painted Mask. Now, what's really interesting about this contrast is how we see two warring states within the knight. On one side, you've got his original, fragile state of order, his total reliance on slave morality, this monolithic wall of law, and his pristine iron armor. But simmering right beneath that sterile, rule-bound past is this terrifying hidden chaos. We're talking about a blinding, molten crimson fire, a literal volcanic power, and a dormant Dionysian truth just waiting to absolutely erupt.
Which brings us to the first parable, the parable of the polished dust, where the knight finally admits to his massive self-deception. He says, "I spent a lifetime polishing the monolithic wall of law. I wore my reason as a painted mask, a shield against the staggering empty nothingness." He genuinely believed his rigid stone was the absolute architecture of the universe, right? But in reality, he was just using a facade of reason to hide from the void. So this perfectly illustrates the concept of the veil of Maya. Think of it as an illusion designed specifically to blind a person to reality, keeping them completely enslaved to a phantom order. When the jester laughed, that laughter exposed the knight's sacred, absolute logic as this exact veil. In an instant, his precious architecture didn't just break, it literally turned into sawdust. He realized he was never a guardian of truth, but just a laborer in a cemetery of dead metaphors. This realization goes even deeper in the second parable, the parable of the molten ribs. The knight had desperately tried to seal his buried darkness beneath that suit of pristine iron, but the jester's blade didn't seek his blood, it sought that Dionysian truth he'd been hiding. As he puts it, "My armor was not a defense, it was a beautiful cage for a volcanic power that was always meant to consume me." The iron cracks open, and all those staring eyes of reason he tried to blindfold are finally set free. Section 3. Antithesis. The Shattered Mirror.
To really grasp the horror of this antithesis phase, this violent collision of rigid order and chaotic reality, we need to talk about the Jungian shadow. These are the unconscious, repressed, and downright dark aspects of the personality. And here is the real kicker. The jester isn't actually a separate entity. The jester is the stalking manifestation of the knight's very own Jungian shadow. The knight is literally being forced to swallow his own darkness and face a horrific confrontation with the self. Let's move to this and see how it builds. We can actually map out the exact chronological steps of his agonizing psychological death across these parables. Step 1, that grand wall of law totally dissolves into sawdust. Step 2, his pristine iron armor cracks wide open to reveal staring eyes. And finally, step 3, when he looks into the king's mirror expecting to see a sovereign, the mirror reflects absolute emptiness. There is literally nothing behind the mask. And that brings us to the parable of the king's mirror, which is this incredibly pivotal moment. Deep in the absolute silence of what's known as the seventh solitude, his artificial ego is completely incinerated. As he proclaims, "I died as a man of order and was resurrected as a sovereign architect of the void." It's an agonizing psychological death for sure, but the destruction of his past is exactly what allows him to step far beyond the traditions of the herd.
Then, in the parable of the bleached stars, the cosmic scale of this event is revealed. The great star rises, and its intense fire literally bleaches the gods from the sky, leaving the heavens as empty as a desert. But here's the thing. The knight doesn't despair. While others might weep for lost idols, he realizes that the purifying silence of a godless universe isn't a grave at all. It is the ultimate blank canvas.
Section 4. Synthesis, the monstrous rebirth. So the crucial point is that the knight hasn't merely survived to psychological collapse. He has completely evolved into what we call a proto-Ubermensch. This is the monstrous synthesis of his former logic and that newly unleashed primal chaos. He's now a fully integrated autonomous being who no longer looks up to the heavens or to any external authority for validation. He is entirely his own master.
And we see this evolution perfectly captured in the parable of the new music. As the cultural tablets of his old kingdom are completely smashed, he says, "I did not mourn the noise, I took it and began to play, turning the screams of my former identity into a new, harmonious music." He's actively taking the rhythmic, chaotic sounds of the world's collapse and transmuting them directly into art.
He has fundamentally changed how he interacts with reality. The rigid musts of destiny, that exhausting treadmill of blood he used to walk, is entirely replaced by the play of the child. He realizes that in an indifferent cosmos, the only truly rational response is the freedom to play within the ruin. He steps up as the sole architect of this magnificent, doomed drama. Section 5. Architect of the Void. To reach this conclusion, the knight performs a radical process called philological transvaluation. This is the absolute incineration of his old slave morality in order to reclaim the vital, self-defining flame of the strong. He is literally smashing the cultural tablets of his past so he can redefine reality entirely on his own dark terms. It's a violent, absolute reclamation of power. And this brilliantly illustrates the brutal new laws of his disenchanted wasteland. First, the will to power is now the only remaining law. Second, he totally redefines good as the fire that consumes, and bad as the stagnant ice of piteous peace. And finally, the oppressive spirit of gravity, it's dead. He is no longer weighed down by anyone else's dogma. His transformation from a cracked, delusional vessel into an autonomous lawgiver is absolute. Just listen to the sheer power of his closing decree. I do not follow the Jester into the dark to serve him. I follow because I have survived the total collapse of reality and now possess the terrifying strength to command the void. He hasn't just conquered his shadow. He's become the absolute master of it. Which leaves us to consider our own existential realities, doesn't it? Because eventually, everyone's illusions face the Anstas. So, I'll leave you with this one dark, unforgettable thought. When your own wall of law turns to sawdust, will you be consumed by the shadow, or will you command the void? Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the architecture of your own world.